And I got a house, just bought a lake house up at Travis, and I'm looking for a
Oh,
boat.
really? Wow, it's wonderful.
And I'm gonna get a used boat. Only, but he said to get a used boat, I got to wait till July. Are we ready, guys? This is Dr. Charlie Webb. I'm here live at Wake Up with Webb, Conscious Living, taking the time and the effort to think consciously in the times that we are in today. I think most people recognize that we've gone through a storm and we're not out and we don't know where that storm's going. But it's just really, really my pleasure to be able to bring some very unique people onto this show that are thinkers, that have taken effort to live consciously and seek the truth and dive in and do your research, because we have to help ourselves before we can help other people. And the topic that we've got today is probably one of the biggest topics out there. It's been the biggest topic last year. It created a lot of stirs in people's lives. We had lockdowns because of it. People lost businesses because of it. People live in fear because of it. And there's a lot of unknowns. And I'm just here to ask you to do this. I've got an incredible individual here that has an incredible background, Jorge Araujo, and I'm going to have him talk about himself a little bit and back up who he is. And he really is going to be someone here that's going to offer you some really good information, some deep dive. We're going to actually bring up where you can actually do additional research. So it's not going to just be George talking, but we all need to understand this, whether you're a layperson and you want to take care of your family and you want to have a better idea. Am I getting the real information here? You be the judge of that, and then do the follow-up. If you're a practitioner, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to know for yourself, your family, but what information are you sharing with those who trust you? Is it the right information? Have we been misled somewhere? So just be open. We're going to get, with all the political crap out there, we're going to try to be as neutral as we can with this, guys. We just feel it's important to say, have you seen this? Do you understand this virus? Do you understand this vaccination? And we are blessed to have George on with us. These are typically about 30 minutes. We're going to go an hour. That's how important this is. So with that said, George, thank you so much for your time. I've listened to you for so many times. We've known each other for a long time, but this subject I've gotten in. You've been on a lot of different podcasts on this subject over the last few months, and I've got to watch quite a few of them, and I just couldn't resist. So I wanted you to come on today. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, so people understand why should I listen to you, George?
Well, that's a whole other discussion, but thanks for the intro, Charlie. It was very generous. I am a chemist by training and spent many years honing analytical skills in laboratory positions in the pharmaceutical world. I spent total, I would say, about 10 years in some sort of scientific capacity, data evaluation, analysis, setting up experiments, quality control chemistry, quantitative analysis of all kinds. But then I went into the business of science at Merck. I worked for Merck for about 8 years and spent about half my tenure there on what I like to call the business of science. I supervised and ran a bunch of business groups, both in pharmaceutical operations and clinical research operations, and left there, I'm going to say, after about 4 years in clinical supply operations, where I got to see sort of the back end of the process, right? The drug leaves our docks and then it actually gets administered to thousands of cohorts across hundreds of various studies globally. And so running those operations was fascinating, very helpful, and it taught me a lot of wonderful things and important things about the clinical development process, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. Big fan of clinical development. I think if it's done right, it's wonderful. And it's an exceptional weapon in making sure we get important drugs into the hands of people that desperately need it in an efficacious and safe way. It's when we abandon the clinical development process that we get ourselves into trouble. And I think it's those concerns that have kind of caused me to express my opinions on the topic of vaccinations. I think, unfortunately, we have strayed from clinical development the way it should be run. and it's just overly abbreviated, and we're getting ourselves into trouble. And it's not just about this latest SARS-CoV-2 situation, but I think it's endemic to vaccines in
Okay.
general.
So before we dive into that, and just so everyone knows, your stance on vaccines, and we're going to also talk about, is this a real vaccine or is it qualified as one? But I know your stance, you've told me before, you're not anti-vax. You're anti not doing the homework, not doing the clinical, right?
Yes, that's right. I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch of the imagination. I consider myself a data-oriented person, and I try to follow the conclusions where the data takes me. And if we're doubling down on conclusions that are not sufficiently buttressed by data, and by data in clinical development, I'm specifically talking about phase 1 through phase 4, post-marketing surveillance, all the way from animal tox studies through phase 1, first in man, through phase 2, which is typically a hybrid of safety and efficacy, phase 3 efficacy, and phase 4 and phase 5 post-marketing surveillance till we finally get to an IND and an NDA. I think that the process is set up where the data necessary to arrive at conclusions necessary to develop and release, license, market, commercially distribute a safe and efficacious product. It's all there. The process is designed for that. And I'm married to that process. And when I see deviations from it, I get alarmed. And so I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I do believe that there are significant gaps between the claims that are being made with regard to safety of vaccines and what the data actually suggests.
And when you say that, that's a broad statement. We're not just talking about this current vaccination for CV-19. You're talking about it as a whole, the way that vaccinations are marketed. This is the statement was toward all. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm talking about the vaccine release process in general. It's a biological, it's not a pharmaceutical. And so there are certain abbreviated steps to a typical clinical development regimen that are afforded vaccines that are not afforded other solid dosage forms. I'm concerned about those. I really am, because we're cutting important corners. Time is abbreviated significantly, and we need the time. Just from a basic molecular stability analysis, we just don't have enough data across the board to see how the vaccine is reacting in the body. So the pharmacokinetic side is really weak. The way that we set up many of these studies, where control groups, for instance, are weakened by comparison, not against some sort of inert placebo, but it's compared against another vaccine. And so you can see the problem with that. If you're comparing not against an inert placebo, but against another vaccine, then obviously you're canceling out a whole host of issues that haven't been addressed in that vaccine. So I don't think that that's helpful. We don't do that with anything else. And I don't think there are sufficient questions that are being asked and answered. There's lots of questions that are being asked. I don't think that there's a serious effort to address those things. And so at the end of the day, I think you're left with a generally unsafe product. And the system does not lend itself, Charlie, to an open discussion on these things. I think it's been overly politicized, and I think it's getting us in trouble.
Okay, so we're gonna come back to this, because I want to dive into exactly what this messenger RNA, as we talk about the specific virus today, the CV-19. I want to go into what's in this. How can this affect our DNA? How does this affect cellular health? How are they transporting this through the cell membrane? So for you guys listen again, this is Dr. Charlie Webb, Wake Up with Webb, Conscious Living. We've got an incredible guest, Jorge Araujo, who spent years with Merck, and even before this, a scientist. He knows a little bit about immunity. He knows about drugs, pharmacology, putting these vaccinations together, and he's bringing his experience and his thoughts to the table here, so we can consider and again think consciously about what information are we not getting that we should getting, and why is this information not coming to us. So before we dive into that deeper, George, on a virus itself, there's a lot of, what surprises me, I work with a lot of practitioners, bright, very, very intelligent, with a lot of passion and purpose to change human life, and they have huge hearts. But I have seen a lot of them, maybe, I don't know if where their studies, but not understanding fully, number one, the immune process and how that's different from vaccination, and also a virus in itself. What is this? What's the size of it? And some of the precautions that we're using, are they effective? Can they be effective? And so can we start with that and what you had to do when you were dealing with viruses? How did you protect yourself?
Well, I was a supervisor for a little bit over a year in vaccine sterile quality operations. I was responsible there for a biochemistry team that analyzed bacterial endotoxin. It was one of the series of steps that a vaccine product or any drug product actually had to go through before it was released into the open market. And so being part of vaccine sterile quality ops, I had firsthand knowledge and experience and what it takes to make a vaccine. And I was exposed to PPE procedures, which are rather elaborate in the pharma world, as you can imagine, especially in the area of live viruses. Of course, that's personal protective equipment. And so I come at this with a very particular set of skills and experience, which have caused me to really question a lot of what we're hearing, actually, with regard to how one protects oneself from viruses. And I think, like I said, unfortunately, there's very little science, and I think there's a lot of non-scientific analysis that is entering into public policy here, and I think that's concerning.
So if we are trying to protect ourselves from a virus is typically around the size of what, 100 microns?
Yeah, so I'd like to use nanometers, right? 100 times 10 to the negative 6 meters. It's pretty darn small. And so my criticisms have been, and by the way, these have been the criticisms of Anthony Fauci and also Jerome Adams. If people go back, for instance, and look and just start March 1st and March 30th, I'm thinking specifically March 8th and March 31st, you have Fauci on 60 Minutes, and you have Jerome Adams then, I think on Fox on March 31st. And they are specifically doubling down on the uselessness of wearing conventional masks. And by that, I'm talking about surgical and cloth masks. And they basically said, look, it'll make you feel good, but other than that, it just simply won't have a market effect on limiting transmissibility. And some of this is biology and some of it is basic physics. We're dealing with masks here that are not going to confine a virion, which is a viral molecule, that is in the order of magnitude of anywhere around 100 nanometers. So you can look this up. I mean, it can range anywhere from 60 to maybe 300 or 400 nanometers. And so you're looking at essentially trying to prevent something the size of an automobile, maybe a Honda, from driving across a wide open barn door that's 200 feet across or 250 feet across. I mean, that would be illogical. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here. I think the other problem is that when you sneeze and when you're coughing into these masks, this is an airborne virus, right? So you've got a aerosolized viral particulate that essentially not affected by gravitational forces. And so it's floating around freely. And it how's it transmitted? Well, it's breathed in. And then it goes through it has a particular affinity for upper respiratory tract. And then it works its way through. By the way, the incubation period is around anywhere from 2 to 14 days. I think the analogies between looking at it and the measles virus, for instance, have been very helpful for people who don't know SARS viruses. SARS, whether you're talking about the original one, which also originated in China, by the way, in 2002, and in this latest manifestation, SARS-CoV-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome, it does have a particular affinity for our respiratory mucosa. And I think if you just look at the basic biology and the physics, things just don't add up. And policy doesn't change. Science doesn't change, Charlie, in 2 or 3 months. We have 15 to 20 years worth of peer-reviewed safety science on masks and personal protective equipment pertaining specifically to influenza-related virus. And that is all pretty consistent. Cloth and surgical masks are not effective. And in many cases, N95 masks are not effective. We have lots of data on this stuff. And all of a sudden, this begins to change in May to June of this year. Why? How does one of the heads of NIH come out and say that, surgical and cloth masks are not effective at all, but all of a sudden 2 months later, they're very effective and to the point where we should double down in terms of public policy? Well, how does that happen with the Surgeon General of the United States? How does he take position A and then take literally the opposite, a month or two later. And I've heard them try to come back and say, well, we didn't know what we know now. Well, that's an absurd statement. We don't know anything new with regard to the fundamental structure of viruses now than we've known for the last 20 to 25 years. So I just don't think those statements are rooted in good science. I think that politics and political considerations are entering into scientific policy and matters of public health, and that's very dangerous.
I was looking down at my phone for a second. I wasn't not paying attention. I was looking for an article.
Yeah,
that
I
I
hope
pulled
it's
up
boring you.
recently. Yeah, I pulled up an article recently, and I can't find it now, but there was a study done on how these masks can actually increase, obviously, respiratory challenges and actually cancer. And I'll try to get that for you, but it's interesting. You had described a dirty diaper on your face, time after time after time. And what are we breathing back in that the body's not wanting to bring in? And it's like, even in the surgical situation, to help people understand the difference, this is not for virus. This is for bacteria, quite a bit larger than a virus, to protect that going into and spittle going into the wound or so forth. And once that surgeon's done for that particular event, that comes off, he's washed, the next event, wash, new one on. And I don't know about you, but it comes out of my pocket.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And just gets into PPE management, the idea that people are constantly tinkering with their masks. I think people who are listening in may appreciate the fact that vast majority of germs are administered into the body, mostly through our hands. I mean, we touch our faces. I am now. And no, I don't have COVID, thank goodness. But 2,000 to 3,000 times a day, we're touching our lips, we're touching our eyes. And so bacteria alone is a significant concern. And so what I meant by the wet diaper is that you are constantly lodging wet globulates into your masks. And if you go on the CDC's website itself, they have a typical plan guidance sheets that they put out. And I think July 31st of 2020 specifically stated that the masks that we're talking about right now that are in question are completely useless inside 15 minutes. And the reason is because that, they get wet from breathing and from moisture and from coughing. And as a result, the filtration rate drops through the basement. And so they're no longer filtering at that point. So what have you done? Well, you've confined essentially a bacterial Petri dish to within a millimeter of your lips, right? Which doesn't seem like a great idea. And then you're constantly tinkering with it, right? So your hands are going to your face. You're touching things, so then bringing your hands to your face again. And it should be reasonably common sense here that this is doesn't seem like a really great practice. So now you have a virus. And again, people are welcome to go to the CDC's own website, September 10th to 20th, where they look at infectious fatality rates. And they can kind of scroll down. They have a planned scenario. They have 5 scenarios. And the most likely scenario in terms of an infectious fatality rate of this virus places even the most at-risk groups, that is, individuals who are very elderly and who are very sick, have a survivability rate that is upwards of 94%. And again, these are individuals who are burdened with things like metabolic syndrome disorders. I'm thinking about obesity or diabetes, for instance. And these are individuals who are highly compromised. In many cases, they're very elderly, and they have an inordinately high survivability rate. And then when you work your way down the demographic, it gets to a point where the virus is literally negligible. We find that the virus's profile is actually the opposite in young children relative to the flu. Children are virtually unaffected at all by SARS-CoV-2, whereas they are by the flu. So the transmissibility path is actually the opposite. So whereas the flu, children are giving this to adults, you actually find the opposite is happening with SARS-CoV-2. Thank goodness that adults, anybody 40, 50 years of age, the survivability rates is well upwards of 99%. And I'm being generous here. I mean, you're getting into 99.3, 99.7. I would recommend that people go and they see the breakdown by the CDC. That has not changed with time at all. So why the draconian measures with something that is, I think from a statistical significance perspective, largely negligible?
So now that we know that? And again, where can they find that information again, George, so they can follow up on what you're saying?
Well, I made a reference to July 31st of 2020. They can go on the CDC and they can look at specifically the efficacy of surgical and cloth masks. And they have a planned guidance publication. I would go there, and I made references to the September 10th, 2020 citation, which actually looks at, I think that's really useful information, looks at infectious fatality rates by age demographic.
Okay.
And I'm thinking specifically at table 3, and you scroll over to the right side, there's a planned scenario number 5. That is the most likely scenario. And it's just very conclusive that with regard to harm to public health, this virus is largely negligible.
So as we look at past history and how we handled ourselves and our children with the flu, what we're seeing today is much safer than the flu. Yet we weren't taking any precautions. Our children weren't going to school with masks, even though they were affected at a much greater rate. But yet we want our kids, even though they're not going to, I guess it's very low when they're not going to pass it on to adults or anything. And again, all this information's there if you just take the time and the effort. And guys, I hope now that he's given you research, he's done all the work. He's done all the running. And now we're just asking, what do we need to look at? If the information's out there, let's look at it so we can understand what's being fed to us. And it's been out there for a while. I've looked at it, and part of the reason I'm having a conversation with George, because I know this, but I don't have the credibility to talk about this.
Well, Charlie, if I may interrupt for just a moment, you mentioned this comparability with the flu, and I want people to understand that when people make those statements, when I make that statement, I'm not saying that it's the same virus. It isn't. They're different viruses. But I think when, as we learn more and more and more, we recognize that in terms of the fatality profile, it's starting to correspond more and more and more, and it has been for some time, with that of the flu. Now, I didn't make that statement. We start seeing statements like that from Dr. Mike Ryan, who works for the World Health Organization. I remember specifically reading it back in October in the Irish Times of all places, but it's all over the place. People can find that citation in multiple news sources. But it struck me when he made the statement that at that time, there were around 1 million global deaths. And he made the statement that around 750 million people had only about 10% had antibodies for the virus. And so his conclusion was, man, we got a long way to go, only 750 million people. So I think it's logical to look at the number of people that had died. And you can find this information. Johns Hopkins has an excellent tracking mechanism. The COVID-19 project is really good. I think if you go on Worldometers, that's really, really good. They look at various data sources. You're probably familiar with that, Charlie. I mean, you could go.
Yeah, what I found interesting is the same number of people in the United States died in 2020 as 19, as 18, about 2.8 million died. No change, even though there's more population. But if you look at what happened to the deaths from flu or cardiovascular, they've come down.
Yes, that is a matter of some controversy. I want to touch on that in just a moment because that's a really important point. But I was going to suggest that if you look at what Mike Ryan was saying, that gives credibility to the comparative nature of the flu and COVID-19 in terms of its effect on mortality rates. So if you've got about 1 million out of 750 million at that time, what does that come out to? That's around 1 in 750, if you will, correcting for all the zeros. That's around 0.13%. If you look at the mortality rate of the flu, that's around 0.1% or so. Okay, so that's where that started for me. It was back in October of 2020. And then since then, we've seen a number of other sources that have corroborated that. Now, to your point, I would recommend that people look up the research. And this is an example of how things are getting way too politicized on this. And it's very concerning. The research of Genevieve Bryant, who is a researcher with Johns Hopkins University. She has a long line of publications, and she's a person of great credibility. And she made the mistake of publishing a couple of months ago the data that speaks to exactly the kinds of persons that are being affected by COVID, the overall aggregate effect on populations, on the American population. She looked at a number of traditional other causes of death, certainly cardiac deaths, carcinogenic deaths, And she kind of stepped back, and she was very concerned that there was this very suspicious drop, a commensurate drop in other sources of mortality for the last 20, 25 years, but a commensurate increase precipitously with COVID deaths. And so she simply asked the question, and it was a twofold question. Is this virus really as serious as it has been made out to be? If one was to look at policy, right? You've got lockdown measures that have been rather aggressive and rather wide globally. You have mask policy. There are now mandates in dozens of states. We have about 90% mask compliance, by the way, generally speaking, even in places where there aren't mask mandates, because people are scared and they're very concerned. And so when you look at public policy and you look at the data, she's saying, man, there seems to be a real gap here. And she asked the question. She wasn't declaring anything. And they shut down the article. And they shut down the article on the basis that it could throw into question the severity of the virus. Well, of course it's
So,
based on, of course it is. Let's have a conversation about that.
Right. If scientifically we can answer that, yes, we can prove the severity of it. Why would they shut down a question? I mean, we can only, just like if I can't question you, we're in trouble, right? You have to back up what you're telling us, and the things that you can't back up, we both have to go seek that truth and find that. But to simply not be able to say, I have a question, and they shut me down, that's a fear response. They can justify it by, well, right, we do have the truth and we don't want you to throw someone else off, which is a justification.
She made a proposition. She made a proposition. It had content. That content was grounded in objective data. If you want to engage the merit of the proposition on the data, that's a really great way to do it. We can all learn from that. But if you shut her down because it goes against some narrative and you don't do an analysis based on the data, I mean, you're really hurting people in the long run because you're dealing with issues.
Well, at this point in time, there's opposition to any kind of question. I mean, we want to get it right for the safety of all of us. I don't know all the answers yet. That's why I go to people like you. That's why I want to know the answers, so I don't throw someone off base. But to not be able to ask a question and just trust Big Brother that have all the answers, that's a scary situation. We got a lot of questions coming, George, until I have some of these.
Sorry, shall I take a question?
Yeah, is there, because I want to get moving in, and we're going to make certain we answer your questions, guys.
We can do it before or after I get into this, some of these candidates like Moderna.
Yeah, I want to get into that. I don't want to leave that. So until I get these, I want to keep rolling. So
I'm sending them over to you.
Here. Okay. So, yes. Okay. So let me take a look here and let's see what we can, okay. Why then, this is a great question. I think I know the answer because I've got several family members. I got a lot of people that are in the hospital right now or work in the hospital, nurses and so forth. Why then ICUs are full of people and dying with such a speed? Unfortunately, this is not what I'm seeing clinically. I have overbooked with long haulers, even though they are surviving. They are a mess. I have never seen the likes of this from flu, EBV, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so good question. Are we seeing this in the hospitals? Do you know what's going on? And just kind of your thoughts on that. And again, I before we go further, guys, understand there's people in the hospitals every single year with the flu, and it gets to the point almost every year that they have to add hospital beds. They get to this version of it. So a lot of people are dying every year. I think in this country, I may be wrong, I think 70 to 80,000 people a year. Does that sound right, George? Or am I off on that? So there's no denying that people are dying of this. But how many people are dying of coronavirus compared to how many of them have the flu? Because we know, and there's research on this too, the false positives with coronavirus because of the times that they run this through to determine if it's a true virus. So give me your thoughts on that. That's just.
Well, I think you're right. I think there are a number of factors, and I'm not taking away the subjective experience of your questioner. I think they're not making this up. It's true in their experience. But we got to step back and we got to look at the data on aggregate. And let's just start with hospital capacities, because we hear this a lot. We hear our hospitals are full. And I would say that, if you go back and you do a horizontal analysis on hospital policy, you're going to see a rather consistent profile. I mean, I've done just here in the state of Texas, I've gone back, Houston hospitals from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, they were operating at the same capacity that they're operating now. And guess what? They're designed to do that. They're going to go broke if they don't. So we don't wish and we don't pray for people to be sick, obviously, but people are sick. And hospitals are a place where they can get appropriate treatment. And so hospitals are going to operate at peak capacity. They're designed to do that. And I understand there's peaks and troughs, depending on things that are ailing the population, but they are designed for that purposes. So I think, unfortunately, there's been a bit of spin with regard to the notion that COVID somehow is unleashing this unprecedented load on hospital capacity relative to previous years. So that's largely inaccurate. And of course, I would add ICU rooms to that. Now, it's a matter of, again, please take the issue up with CDC's routine reports on this, that the virus is largely affecting individuals who are immunocompromised. Again, metabolic syndrome disorders, a big concern. Elderly, big time, for reasons that we do not fully understand, obviously, for immunosuppressed reasons. And so we know who the virus is killing, and we know how many it's killing. Now, here's the dilemma with that. The coronavirus task force, and I'm thinking about Fauci and the Dr. Deborah Birx is no longer with the coronavirus task force. But much fodder was made about this, and I think she was telling the truth, but it's very concerning that the CDC engages in rather liberal counting techniques to determine who has in fact died of COVID and who has not. And I think that's concerning. If you go back and you look at their publications, I mentioned the September 10th, 2020 publication. The month before, there is data from the CDC which suggests very strongly that the total number of individuals on a percentage basis that have actually died of COVID is in a range of around 6%.
Yeah, I read that.
Now, at that time, I'm going back to August here. At that time, there were some 153 to 154,000 deaths. And when it was all tabulated, it came out to be about 9,210 deaths of individuals who we could say that they had directly subsided as a result of COVID. Yeah. But people who were dying of many other causes, but simply tested positive, and through a basic PCR test, which basically quantifies the amount of viral DNA. In this case, it's an RNA virus, so the amount of viral RNA, that qualifies that individual to have died of COVID. Now, does that sound like a really great idea? Because we don't do that with anything else. We've never done that with any other virus. Why are we doing that now? So I am skeptical. I'm very skeptical, and I think we should be, of the number of deaths that are being attributed to this virus. Yeah. But even if we're not, Charlie, even if we take them at face value, if you look at that mortality rate, it is rather negligible. And we have never had policy that has been this exaggerated, and that should concern us.
Well, we still have the average death age for the COVID. Again, I go through the same sites you do, is about 78. The average time of death for someone here in the United States is 78. And again, if the numbers means, hey, we have this huge onslaught of hundreds of thousands of dying of COVID, how come the total number of deaths, again, this can be researched out on the same sites that you've mentioned, the same number of people, about 2.8, died in 2020 as in 2019. So where's the additional 200,000? Where is that, right? So anyway, we got to keep moving. And guys, thank you so much for your questions. I don't care if you have skepticism, whatever it is. This is an open court to find the truth. So every question
I would recommend that people go back, Charlie, and look at the work of Dr. Genevieve Bryant from Johns Hopkins University on this very issue, because she does break down sources of mortality by age group and demographic.
and then renders conclusions.
So do me a favor.
Objective data. It isn't just, we're not just contriving this on purpose.
Yeah, give me that one more time, because this is important. I want people to take their time and do the research. What's her name again?
Dr. Genevieve Bryant with Johns Hopkins University. She is an economist, but she's also a data researcher. I mean, so she tabulates data, and she's part of their medical analysis team.
Is there any particular place they can go? Because I know that you've got all this in your head.
No, I think if they look up her publication, they're going to see quite a bit of controversy around it, but it's rather uncontroversial. It's much ado about nothing. Genevieve Bryant, and she's from Johns Hopkins University on this issue. And I think what they should, when they put in something in their research on their search box, on their search engine, it should be something to the effect of Dr. Genevieve Bryant analysis of COVID deaths.
Perfect.
And that kind of thing.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Moving on, I'm going to do maybe
impressive analysis.
Yeah, I'll do one more for now, and then we got to move into the next topic. And this is a great question too, because I know that you always give sources, and maybe we missed it here. They said, who is they that is shutting down the questioning that goes against the narrative? Who is they? Like, for example, we had the question come out that, hey, this is what I'm seeing, and boom, they got shut down. Like just like Judy Milkovich, boom, got shut down, and we know her credibility and everything. So, is there any specific source that you know of that obviously she got shut down? You can't find her. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know. Do you know how to answer who they is?
And I think this is a fair and an honest question, but I would push back ever so gently, because this has been rather ubiquitous all over the news. I mean, there have been individuals who say something that are controversial. We had a group of doctors that showed up at the Capitol, I think here in the state of Texas, and then of course nationally, and they were challenging the whole narrative, for instance, on hydroxychloroquine. Now, I mean, I realize people have specific opinions on that, but it's an unassailable fact, for instance, at that time and now, that HCQ is rather harmless if it's administered appropriately within sort of established regimen, dosage wise. It's rather innocuous. So we don't have to worry about the safety. The question that's been open-ended here is, what exactly is the efficacy here of HCQ on SARS-CoV-2? We're not really worried about the safety, because the thing's been in circulation. It's been administered to patients since 1955. And so you've got physicians that are showing up, they're making public statements about this. They're concerned about the politicization of healthcare, and they're shut down. I mean, look up at the work of Salome Gold, for instance, right? She's the one that was leading that group of doctors, for instance, about 3 or 4 months ago on HCQ, and was shut down by big tech. You've got Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, flagging people for basically questioning the narrative with regard to the severity of SARS-CoV-2. We're not questioning that it's a real virus. We're not questioning that it can kill people. We're simply suggesting that the response is akin to killing a fly with an elephant gun. That's what we're claiming here. Yeah. That the response to the virus is having significant unintended consequences. Robert Redfield from the CDC has himself said that the unintended consequences here are severe, from a precipitous rise in suicides among all age groups, particularly people under age 35, right? Depression is through the roof. You've got individuals who are not seeking care for cardiac conditions, who are staying inside because they're scared to death. Individuals who are not pursuing their cancer treatments. This is ubiquitous throughout the literature on the internet. So people are being shut down for taking a position that our response is unwarranted, that our response is worse than the problem. You start making those claims and you will get flagged. I've gotten flagged myself. You push back to no avail. There's nothing you can do. And I think that's really frustrating. It's unfortunate. So they would be Twitter, Facebook, less so, but certainly YouTube. I've had issues on Instagram. My wife, who is a registered nurse, has had issues with that. And there's tons of cases where that's the case. Why?
And again, George, we've been shut down, for the same thing, words we use. But what's interesting, I remember watching the physicians, the experts come out in DC, and there was probably 12 of them. I don't remember the number. But here again, you said that hydrochloroquine's been out since 1950 something. The safety studies are at the yin yang. Yet, no, that's not safe. yet they can put a vaccination out in 6 months and say it's safe. It hasn't been around long enough. Why is that okay?
Charlie, sorry to interrupt you. Forgive me. Dr. Harvey Risch, who is I think unassailable with regard to his credentials on epidemiology, published in the American Journal of Epidemiology on May 27 on HCQ, and did a rather statistically impressive analysis of why HCQ should be administered to patients who are suffering from COVID, as long as the drug was administered early in the onset manifestation of symptoms. It was much less efficacious with people who had full-blown symptoms. He was assailed on public networks for that. This is Dr. Harvey Risch, R-I-S-C-H, who is with the Yale School of Public Health. Some 2 months later, Yale School, much to their credit, who is no bastion of conservatism, came out and released a paper in his defense, saying that with regard to scientific integrity and history in terms of the merit of his publications, the guy walked on water, and Yale stood by their man. Okay. Now his work is extensive. He referenced dozens of other peer-reviewed studies in his analysis. Was this picked up at all? Was it hailed as a potential breakthrough? Think about the amount of money that we have spent on the Pfizer novel tech. Well, it's not licensed yet, but on all the work to do R&D there. The same thing with Moderna. Think about the amount of money that's being the taxpayers are having to fork out to the tune of around $2 billion for the first 100 million doses of the novel tech vaccine. Think about the amount of money that is being spent on a statewide basis to distribute this stuff, and on and on and on. And here we had some legitimate basis to pursue a therapeutic pathway, and we didn't. Why? I mean, I got my own opinions here, but the idea that there's no politics involved in this, come on.
Well, again, you can't even say, I mean, as a wellness functional medicine doctor, there's, how do we boost our immune system? Vitamin D, vitamin C, get out in the sunshine. You can't talk about that. And that's just, why wouldn't you do those things? Why they're not dangerous, right? But anyway, we've got to move on to the messenger RNA vaccination. You just started into it. You got 2 companies out there that are leaders in it. Let's go into that. What are they developing? What's in this? And what do we need to be aware of?
So a traditional vaccine, and I may be preaching to the choir here, but a traditional vaccine will administer, as part of the vaccine medium, will administer some component of the virus, a protein component of the virus that is designed to elicit an immune response. Now, it can't without certain other adjuvants, and you've heard about things like thimerosal and aluminum. They're there specifically to accentuate the immune response. And some other things have some preservative properties. Okay, what's different then on the Moderna vaccine and Pfizer's novel tech? Well, the technology is different. They're using mRNA. Now, mRNA is a specific type of genetic material that is really an outcome of a process called transcription. Now, if you look at DNA, the DNA synthesis process, you've got a protein synthesis process, excuse me. It's really essentially in 2 aggregate steps, transcription and translation. There is a step at which mRNA is produced from taking a copy of a DNA molecule and creating this mRNA, which is a version of that DNA molecule with some tweaks. And that version will then be read by a protein manufacturing site in your cell called the ribosome. It will build an amino acid sequence that will then build proteins. So what's happening here? mRNA from the virus is being synthetically created in a laboratory. That mRNA, it's not the actual virus mRNA, it's being copied, synthetically produced, right? A mirror image. And then it's being administered into the body as part of this vaccine. It's within a vaccine medium. So all those other adjuvants that we were talking about are still in the vaccine medium. And it's administered in such a way that it can find its way into the cell's cytoplasm. And then the cell's machinery, the process that I just described, generates proteins. Now it's using a synthetic copy of the virus's mRNA. So it's creating viral proteins. So the body thinks it has the actual viral proteins, but it does not. It's a copy. And then it generates, or it results in an immune response. The body sees this antigen and it produces antibodies specific to that antigen. And that's where the immune response comes in. Now this, I think, I've said it on many other forums, I think it's brilliant. I do. If I had a choice on how I would design a vaccine, that would be it. I think it's brilliant. But there are serious problems, not the least of which is that we've never had a licensed mRNA product ever. And the only one that we have right now, which is not licensed, which has been sort of rushed in this Operation Warp Speed, it's not licensed, but it's been kind of grandfathered under this compassionate use policy within investigational new drugs. The problems, Charlie, is that the mechanism to administer the mRNA into the cell's cytoplasm is rife with all kinds of problems. mRNA cannot make its way through it can't make its way, let's say, let's keep it simple, through the bloodstream unless it is encapsulated in some way. The body will denature it. It'll decompose it. It's very frail. And so we need to find a way to shuttle it to the cell without it decomposing. How do we do that? Well, there's something called an LNP. It's a lipid nanoparticle, and it basically encapsulates the mRNA. It keeps it essentially safe from denaturing. That PEG, it's called polyethylene glycol, is specifically designed to get it into the cell's cytoplasm so the protein synthesis process can continue. All right, I have spoken a lot on polyethylene glycol because unfortunately I don't think it's getting enough attention. It's a carrier molecule that is all over the literature in terms of its ability to incite an autoimmune response that in many cases can be quite deadly. It's very frustrating to me that this isn't getting enough airtime. It really is. And this is without getting into the safety issues of Moderna. I'm focusing specifically on Pfizer's novel tech here because that's the one that was number one to the market. I can say a few other things about issues that I had with Moderna's safety study. 45 patients, 3 different cohorts when they released their prospectus back in May. But specifically with Pfizer's novel tech, we are seeing a boatload of adverse reactions already. CDC is publishing this data. It's looking, interestingly enough, at adverse reactions from the flu from 2018 and 2019. They looked at about 180 million doses. So far, we've had about, as of December of 2020, we've got about 4 million doses of the COVID vaccine that administered. So the numbers are statistically significant enough where we can do a comparison. And listen, it's a 30-fold gap. Let's just let that sink in and let's think about that. The number of adverse reactions to COVID are substantially more than flu thus far, okay? I'm sorry, go ahead.
30-fold.
Yes, that's right. So I'm happy to pull that up. I don't have the URL with me, but I'm very happy to text it to you or email it. Just tell me where to send it. I'm happy to do it. But it's obviously going to be a cdc.gov, and it does an interesting comparison. This is alarming, and we should ask ourselves why. Well, we're rushing through the safety process. We're not doing animal testing. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I was aware.
Okay, so we're not doing the animal tox testing that we should be doing. Any other solid dosage form requires at least a year or 2 of animal tox testing. We didn't do any of that. Our first in man phase 1 studies were abbreviated. We stopped tracking safety cohorts after 2 months of data, right? We changed our patient cohorts that we analyzed in the safety side. We're now changing them in terms of age demographic. We've changed them in phase 3. So now there's this discontinuity built in.
So I stop there for a second. Let's explain what you're talking about. We've got a study being done on a certain class, so to speak, of individuals that don't necessarily bring in the typical person getting this vaccination, right? With some of the I mean, in America, so many people do have a number of comorbidities. We have elderly, we have people. Who are they doing the testing on predominantly?
So if you look at the patient regimens, they're largely healthy individuals. These are not indicative, they're not representative of the American population as a whole. You're not going to see pregnant mothers, right? You're going to see very few people who are seniors, and they're largely healthy seniors. They're not seniors that are suffering from any kind of immunocompromised condition or any other kind of chronic condition. You're not going to see enough Black Americans represented. And for reasons that we don't fully understand right now, many of them genetic, the Black American population does seem to be slightly more susceptible to COVID-19. So we're not seeing enough people represented, and we're not seeing a representative sample in these cohorts that we would see in the American population. Certainly not in the number of people that are going to be receiving the vaccine. Remember, the target is 1 billion people. They want to. What's the latest target is 100 million people in 100 days, right? So, and then we have a second dose. So we're already seeing, this is just on the first dose. It's going to get really colorful with the second dose, which is due to follow at some point in the near future. So I'm simply raising, remember the United Kingdom's equivalent of the FDA has required now that any kind of health worker that may be administering the vaccine cannot do so unless they're doing it at a facility that has resuscitative properties.
Why would they ask for that?
That doesn't sound like a really great icebreaker. And so why is that? Well, because there are significant adverse events. Now, the question remains whether they're statistically significant. And the little bit of data that we're seeing, I would suggest, yes, they are. And they're going to trump what we see with regard to the flu. Now, the question that results from that is why. And I would like to put a lot of the blame on that, on polyethylene glycol, right? Because we have substantial literature that we should be consulting that should give us pause. So here's the deal. We know from the literature, and I'm drawing from the Journal of Analytical Chemistry specifically, I believe it's December 6th of 2016. My memory serves, I think it's, and I mentioned this in another forum, and somebody checked me out, and I think the numbers were correct. I think it was volume 88, number 23. And the conclusions there were that about 72% of the American population already has anti-PEG antibodies, because you see PEG exists in other things. It's existed in other vaccines, but also exists in other products, certainly processed foods. And so it's ubiquitous throughout the population. So some 72% of the American population has PEG antibodies. And about 88% of those have elevated anti-PEG antibodies. So the concerns are that a vaccine with PEG is going to have considerable consequence with regard to an autoimmune response. And so you're going to see a lot of anaphylactic responses. And a lot of these are, in fact, severe anaphylactoid responses. Okay, so is that conclusive? Well, no, it isn't. But we can't just kind of throw our hands up in the air and say, well, it's just a few people. Well, things happen, right? And that's really been the response, I think, of public health officials. That gives me great pause. Never do they actually step back and say, oh my goodness, could we have possibly not have adequately analyzed as a safety signal for something we should have known about, because it is in the literature. And we do know that these antibodies are rife throughout the population. You don't really see a whole lot of introspection, Charlie, not a whole lot of self-examination. This is what I've seen largely when it comes to vaccine policy, and it's very concerning to me.
Well, what concerns me is we know the literature shows us, and again, we want you guys to do the research on your own. We're here. I think you shared quite a bit, George, that the actual danger in this virus, it exists. We know who it exists for, but if you're under the age of 60, it's so minute. What is more dangerous? Taking this vaccination, which we don't have studies on. They're rushing it so fast, and why? And from what we just learned from you, again, if you're the layperson, you might be a little thrown off, and I want to cover something with you. You tell me if I'm right. But if we have the messenger RNA being pulled into the cells, that means every cell. That means every cell has this potential of having a response directed toward that tissue. So we could have multiple organ failure type of autoimmune responses. Am I off somewhere there?
Well, yeah, I think the concerns that I have here are autoimmune responses, because as you probably know, Charlie, the body reacts in an allergenic fashion, but a lot of these things don't show up in full-blown fashion until 6 months later, a year, 2
years.
So I think what we're seeing is really a tip of the iceberg. And again, this is why we need time. You can do accelerated stability studies if they're fairly routine with routine pharmaceuticals, but only after several years have already been taken to do safety and efficacy studies. An accelerated stability study gets you out into the distant future. They'll do studies at ambient temperatures and at elevated temperatures to see if in fact if the active ingredient will break down under stress. They say they're doing some stability studies, but the problem is the cart's before the horse. We typically do stability studies within and before the release process, not after something's been released into the population and say, well, let's check stability studies now. But we don't do this with anything else. Why in the world are we doing it for a technology that we know very little about, for which a drug has never been licensed? These seem to me reasonable questions to ask, no?
Yeah. Well, the other complicating factor I see, when when we're younger, and I consider young in this case, 50, but the people that actually could benefit mostly from this messenger RNA, which you said it's an ingenious methodology if we could get it right, but we haven't had the time. Yeah. But so in this case where it's at, the people that could benefit the most are those that are at the highest risk, the people that are more likely that COVID could affect them. Those people would benefit the most. However, they're also going to be highly or more likely for a side effect or a response to this particular vaccination. So it's a catch-22.
Yeah, but what are they saying in response to that, Charlie? This is, and I would really recommend that people follow up on this and research it. Those are not the people that have been prioritized in the administration of the vaccine. So the people who are at risk have not been prioritized. Why
is that, George?
Why? And listen, this is a matter of public record.
I think you just answered the question. Why they're not
getting. Research this, and it's very alarming. We've had reports all this all the way from open source data like Tucker Carlson on Fox to other literature, where the concern is that you're going to administer a vaccine about which there are substantial open questions, many of which we've just sort of skimmed the surface here. And now you're going to put it in a high-risk population. What could go wrong, right? And so you're going to see people flood hospitals, truly flooding hospitals. And what's going to happen? Well, guess what? All of a sudden, everybody's going to be wondering whether they should be taking this vaccine or not. We already have a high degree of skepticism around this vaccine. We really do. And we've got some 68% of individuals, according to an NBC poll over the last 2 months, 68% of people who have said that they question the merits of vaccine from a safety and efficacy perspective and don't think that they're going to be taking it. The lowest number that I've seen is around 40%. Now, why is that? Well, again, basic questions aren't being answered and we're rushing things. Everybody knows when you put Operation Warp and Speed next to a healthcare product, you try doing that inside a pharmaceutical company as part of a clinical research ops team, many of which I was part of. You try that being your icebreaker, as I like to say in a meeting. Let's see how long you last. Those are two sets of terms that should never accompany each other in a sentence. You do not rush this stuff. You just don't. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot we need.
I mean, look, if we were dealing with an outbreak that was just massive of Ebola or something that we know is just, I understand. Hey, we got nothing to lose. But we know that we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with something that, according to studies, is less deadly than the flu. Is that right?
Well, yeah, based on what I just said with regard to Mike Ryan's, and there is additional, and again, I can send the URL because it's not an actual bound publication. I'm happy to send it to you, from the Lancet, which has looked at data from March and April, horizontal data through the present.
If you could give me these, because I want people,
Yeah.
I want to follow up with people's questions and make them know that this research is out there for them, so they can go dive in and get a better understanding. Whatever you guys come up with, again, I commend you for being here, and I commend you for listening and hanging in there, because there's a lot of fear in this subject, and sometimes, you know.
Yeah, I think there's two issues going on here. Is the mortality rate similar to that of the flu? And what's the adverse profile? Those are the two questions that I've concerned myself with.
Let's see here. We're going to wrap up here. A couple more questions. Okay, this is good. And again, this is really easy to find out because the research there. We have never heard about such a speed and severity of the problem before. We were not informed about flu deaths and difficulties and death rates. This is the only question that holds me to agree with the statement about the flu and COVID being close as far as mortality. Literature is literature, and this stuff's been out forever. I know about these sites. You know about these sites. Where would you send them to show them, yes, this information is there, it's been there, and they're not gonna come out on CNN and Fox and tell you about all this?
I think it's an excellent question, and it raises real concerns with how deaths are tallied. People need to understand that the way we count COVID deaths is not the way that flu deaths have been counted. See, flu deaths have been largely a function of epidemiological models. Now, there's been some of that in COVID too, more on the front end, but we're counting COVID very deliberately. And again, this is where we get into the politicization of healthcare and following the money here. There's a substantial money trail. I won't even get into ventilator policy, which, you know, if you want to have me back, we can talk about that too, because that was greatly concerning. There are absolutely, and it's an unassailable fact, that hospitals are subsidized. It's not a conspiracy, it's just policy, that hospitals are subsidized for the number of patients that they put on a ventilator. Okay, I mean, they are.
But that's, let's make it clear. I've heard everywhere from 50 to 80,000 a patient.
Yeah.
Am I off?
Yeah, the numbers vary too. I'd like to fall on the conservative end of things, somewhere around 36 to 40,000 bucks.
Okay.
I mean, that's not insignificant.
That's not much.
That's not insignificant. But by the way, that's not new. It isn't. It's just that you have the original treatment policy was to get people on ventilators, and of course that's not funny, right? I mean, people have to go under. They're under general anesthesia. Who knows what the cognitive effects are? I mean, it's a whole different set of unanswered questions. And now you've doubled, maybe tripled, quadrupled the population of people that are going on ventilators, whatever that exact number. We know that it's spiked. And so that's dangerous. But let me go back to the number of deaths. When you count flu deaths on a year-on-year basis, that is largely a function of an epidemiological model. You don't actually have clinical sites tabulating the exact number of people who have the flu and are reporting it up to a central reporting center. You have clinics that are reporting this information ad hoc here and there. Epidemiology is largely a statistical science. So they take something that they believe is statistically significant and then they extrapolate thereafter.
Sure.
Okay. And so they do that year on year on year. And so, you know, you're going to see some consistency, and it varies. I mean, you get anywhere from 50 to 80,000 the number of deaths on a year-on-year basis, and sometimes it's spiked. It gets up in a 90,000 range, but it's not like somebody's counting there. Now that's very interesting with regard to COVID. There's a lot of emphasis on counting COVID deaths, and so I'm just asking, why this virus? I mean, I don't know about you, but I have to largely get a magnifying glass out in terms of my daily life to find its effects anywhere.
Yeah.
And when you look at the policy, it just doesn't jive. And we need to be critical thinkers, Charlie.
A couple more questions. Were there, in the past, were there attempts to create COVID vaccination that did pass through animal studies? Are you aware of any of
I
those?
am not aware of any. No.
Okay. Okay. And the last one, you
Most
mentioned,
most efforts have failed, actually. That
Okay.
we don't have any other. There's no corona vaccine for a reason prior to
yeah,
this.
I think you mentioned somewhere along this, at least it's got pulled out here, Israelis data. Was there something there that you talked about that they're wanting to find out, is it available? You said something about some data. I don't recall, but I got a question. Israel's data, is it available? Did you say something about Israel?
I didn't say anything specifically about Israel, but if somebody remembers the topic that I might have been discussing, I can point you very.
Yeah, if we can find a better question or a more clear question, I apologize.
Yeah, I just want to know what the topic or the theme was in question, but I didn't say anything specifically.
Yeah, I didn't remember that, but I don't want to leave it off here. So if you're still here, jump out and help us maybe clarify that before George gets.
Let me make a recommendation that people go and looking not just at the virus, but the response to the virus with regard to lockdowns and mask mandates. I like the way that it's done because they are pulling from various publications to substantiate their claims. Go to rationalground.com. That's, unless they've been censored, but go to rationalground.com. I think their work has been excellent. And where I find them particularly helpful is on mask mandates and correlating those areas where mask mandates have been particularly adhered to, which is, by the way, pretty much nationally. I think Wyoming has the lowest compliance rate, and they're around 89% in terms of mask compliance. Anyway, what they do is they correlate mask compliance over the last several months with cases. And not surprisingly, there's virtually zero connection between those places that have been engaged in rather tight mask mandates and the number of cases. And this is part of the problem. We're chasing cases. We're driving policy on a number of cases.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be flippant. I don't mean to be dismissive of people who are legitimately suffering.
Yeah.
From an epidemiology perspective, from a clinician's perspective, with this kind of viral profile, who cares?
I know.
I mean,
there was someone that mentioned what you just said earlier. He said, didn't the CDC say they expect the same number of people will get this with or without the mask or other measures? It's just a matter of how long. So they read a similar study, it sounds like. And if we don't have any more, anything else you'd like? Well, let me ask you this.
I want to add one more thing about this latest variant, which is a follow-on on this question. People need to understand just basic virology, that viral variants tend to be far more innocuous than the previous variant. And the reason for that, quite frankly, we don't understand all the reasons for that. But what we do understand, it's a function of the fact that the population has largely generated antibodies. And hopefully I don't need to remind too many people here, but I want to explain that your immunity to a particular antigen is not strictly based on antibodies. It is also based on T cells, which is a different kind of cell. Those are mechanisms we don't fully understand, but there's more and more data to suggest that part of the reason why this has been largely unharmful is because SARS viruses and SARS-CoV has been around in the population globally for many, many years, and people are having T cell responses, which is a different immune cell, right? They last longer. Their immunosource is different than a typical antibody. And so that's wonderful news. In other words, there are immune responses that are developing in the population that are making this next variant and the next variant and the next variant largely negligible.
Yeah. Okay.
Much ado about nothing.
One last thing, and again, guys, this is George Araujo. George, I can't thank you enough for your time here. This has been incredible. And hopefully you guys are at least thinking now. I know some of you came in here holding the line on where you were with this. And again, no matter what side, I really respect you for being here. We try to keep this neutral. We're just bringing the information. There's a lot of direction that George gave you. I really do hope that you do this. We talked about some side effects, and I know it's really early on because I don't, from my understanding, I don't know that we're going to see most of these side effects for at least 6 months. But is there particular side effects that we're already seeing that are fairly common with the vaccination that you're aware of?
Well, I think that where we're seeing them are allergenic reactions. Seriously, I mean, I think this is, I think you're going to see an explosion of this kind of stuff. People are developing allergic reactions. So let me get back to MHRA, and that's probably the best example. So the UK's equivalent of FDA. What we were seeing is adverse reaction after adverse reaction after adverse reaction among healthcare workers, because if you recall, they were on the front line and they were some of the first recipients of the vaccine. And so what was happening, Charlie, is that they were going pulseless in many cases, not all, but they were going pulseless and requiring an epinephrine intervention to get them back. The MHRA does not require resuscitative properties across the country for just anything. And I want to point people out to that. And what I'm suggesting is that there is correlation between that kind of response and a vaccine adjuvant by the name of polyethylene glycol. So that's what I'm concerned about. The severe adverse reactions are severe enough that it could be people literally sort of losing consciousness and having to be brought back through an epinephrine injection.
So with that said, I'm pretty sure we all know the answer.
This isn't new, by the way, to Pfizer's novel tech. We did see some indications of this in the Moderna safety trial. If you remember when they did their prospectus in May of 17, they had done a study. All they had was a safety study of 45 patients, 3 cohorts, low, medium, and high dosage. And if you recall, I don't know if you recall, but maybe this will help. 20% of the cohort in the high dose group exhibited very serious adverse reactions that required an immediate medical intervention. That could have lost. It could, yes, absolutely. And so if you extrapolate that out to 20% of whatever population is vaccinated, I mean, I know there's 330 million people in the United States, between 330 and 340 million people. If you assume that, say, 40% get vaccinated, let's just say half, right? And you're looking at about 160, 165 million people. That would be devastating. I mean,
35 million people.
It's just devastating. And then that was the good news. You did see about 6% in a low dose. Low to medium dose was around 6%. Is 6% of around 160 million people acceptable? Take that number and look at the number of deaths which have been liberally counted for COVID. And you tell me if it makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I know the answer to the last question. You've got a wonderful, beautiful family. You got children. What's your thoughts on getting the vaccination, George?
Probably less than a snowball's chance in hell. We have not vaccinated our children, not one of them ever at any time. And we're blessed. God has blessed us with 4 lovely, unbelievably healthy kids.
Yeah,
really.
We see the same thing with my son Landon. Landon's never seen. He's 16. Outside of his when he was born, he's never seen a doctor outside of me. He's never been on a med.
For those people who may be wondering, I thought Araujo was not an anti-vaxxer. I haven't heard anything positive about vaccines. What I want to say is that my criticism is very limited. I really have a serious problem with childhood administered vaccines. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, the CDC schedule has some 72 doses across 16 vaccines by the time you're 18, and most of them are administered by the time you're 5 or 6 years of age. So by default, I'm probably going to be anti-vaccine. But my criticism is limited to the data that we've seen in early childhood diseases. That's where we see a bulk of the manifestation of these diseases. And I'm sorry, there's absolutely a correlation. And I know the correlation is not causation, but at some point, that's where you start when you're doing statistical analysis, right?
Well, that's a whole other conversation. And again, we've talked about a lot. It's not that if a vaccination can be put together in a safe manner, there could be benefits. And I think you've made that clear here today and even on these others.
And they're licensed individually and administered collectively. And that should raise serious flags about that. We should be testing them that way. We're not.
Well, George, I'm probably going to get you back on in the future, but have a wonderful weekend. Thanks for sharing your time with us. I appreciate you.
It's a pleasure. I hope it's been helpful.
And it's just been a wealth of knowledge. So thanks for doing your research and diving in for so many of us that number one, don't have the knowing where to go, but the time. And so I
Yeah,
respect.
and rather than me pontificating endlessly, if you want me to text you or email you some sources, please let me know where I can do that. I'm very
Hi,
happy
buddy.
to do so.
Amen. Love you, buddy.
You guys have a blessed day. Thank you again.
Amen.